By sunrise in 1886, somewhere along a canal in southern Louisiana, the floodgate stood wide open. Water poured through the stone spillway in a roar that carried for half a mile through the cypress trees. Bargemen coming downriver in the early gray light saw it from a distance. That big iron gate cranked all the way back, just like it was supposed to be after a hard rain. But when they tied up at the lockkeeper's landing and climbed the wet stone steps, slick with green algae and morning spray, the man who opened it was gone. His boots stood side by side on the stone apron above the rushing water, bone dry, neat as if he'd just stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. The stones all around were slick with algae and mist. The whole platform glistened dark green in the early light, wet from the spray that never stopped once the gate was open. But those boots sat there untouched by a single drop, leather clean and dry, laces still tied, heels square to the edge where the stone met empty air. The canal cut through low country where the ground never rose more than a few feet above the water line. Cypress trunks stood half drowned in black water on both sides. Spanish moss hung thick from the branches, trailing down into the current. Mosquitoes came in clouds that made a man keep moving, or go mad. The air always smelled like rot and iron, like something old and wet that had been there longer than the levees. You could hear the spillway from the cabins a quarter mile back through the trees, that low thunder that never stopped once the gate was open, a sound that got into your chest and stayed there. On nights when the rain came hard upriver, the lockkeeper had to get out of bed, pull his boots on, and crank the gate by hand to bleed off pressure before it broke the levee and flooded the low farms downstream. It was steady work, lonely work, the kind a man did alone in the dark with a lantern and a cast-iron crankwheel and the sound of water louder than his own thoughts. He'd walk down the mud path from his cabin, set the lantern on the stone platform, and turn that wheel until the gate lifted and the pressure dropped. Then he'd write the time in the logbook, walk back up the path, and go to sleep with the roar of the spillway still in his ears. His name was Aldrich Boudreau. He was 43. He'd worked the lock for 9 years without missing a shift. He lived in the keeper's cabin at the top of the path, a single-room shack with a cot, a wood stove, and a desk where he kept the records. His wife had died 2 winters back from fever. His son worked a timber crew farther south near the Gulf and came to visit twice a year. People along the canal knew him as the kind of man you didn't have to check on. He showed up. He did the work. He kept the gate running smooth. He didn't drink. He didn't talk much. When he did, his voice was low and careful, like a man who'd spent too many years listening to water. On the night he disappeared, the rain had been falling since dusk. Heavy, warm rain that drummed on the cabin roof and turned the path to thick mud. The canal rose fast. You could see the water climbing the stone walls, dark and swollen with runoff from 100 miles upriver. Around 11 o'clock, a bargeman moored downstream near the first bend said he heard the gate crank turning. That slow, deliberate grind of iron on iron. The sound you hear when a man is working the wheel steady and smooth. He didn't think much of it. That was Boudreau's job. That was what he did when the water rose. An hour later, another man living in one of the cabins near the levee said he heard boots on gravel, steady and unhurried, heading toward the lock. He was lying in bed with the window cracked, listening to the rain slow down. He heard the footsteps clear as anything, heavy boots on wet stone, the rhythm of a man walking with purpose. He thought it was Boudreau making a second check on the gate. He rolled over and went back to sleep. Nobody worried. Boudreau knew the lock better than anyone. By first light, the rain had stopped. The sky was the color of wet iron. The canal ran smooth and fast, the surface glassy and black. The gate was open all the way, water streaming past the stone apron in a smooth rush that sounded like wind through a tunnel. The bargemen came up the path with their poles and their ropes, ready to work the lock and move their flatboats through, and that's when they saw the boots. They were standing right at the edge of the platform, toes pointed toward the water. One of the bargemen, an older man named Thibault, who'd worked that canal for 30 years, bent down to look closer. He reached out and touched the leather with 2 fingers. Dry. Completely dry. Not damp, not even cool. Just dry, like they'd been sitting indoors by a fire. He pulled his hand back fast and wiped it on his pants. "Where's Boudreau?" one of the younger men asked. Nobody answered. They looked around the platform. The stones were wet. The algae was thick and slippery. Spray from the spillway had soaked everything. The iron rail, the crank wheel, the wooden posts that marked the edge, everything except the boots. They found footprints in the mud along the path, boot prints clear and deep, going down from the cabin toward the lock. The mud was soft from the rain, soft enough to hold every detail. Heel strike, toe push. The worn edge of the right sole where Boudreau walked with a slight hitch in his step. The prints led straight down the path, across the gravel at the bottom, and onto the stone platform. And then they stopped. There were no prints coming back. The mud between the platform and the cabin was smooth and untouched except for those single tracks going one way. Thibault walked back up to the cabin. The door was unlocked, same as always. Inside, everything looked normal. The cot was made. The stove was cold. A tin cup sat on the shelf next to a half-empty bag of cornmeal. On the desk, the logbook lay open. The last entry was in Boudreau's handwriting, neat and level. The letters formed careful and slow the way a man writes when he's tired. 12:47 a.m. Gate opened full. Pressure relieved. Thibault stared at that line for a long time. The neighbor who heard the boots on gravel swore he'd seen Boudreau walking toward the lock around 11:30. The bargeman downstream heard the crank wheel turning just after 11. But the entry in the logbook said 12:47, more than an hour later, and the handwriting was steady. No shake, no hurry. The kind of writing a man does when he's sitting at a desk with a lantern lit and time to think. Thibault closed the logbook and walked back down to the platform. The other men were standing in a half circle around the boots, not touching them, just looking. "We need to search," Thibault said. They searched the platform first, then the water below. The current was strong but not wild. A man could swim it if he had to, or at least his body would catch on the pilings downstream where the canal narrowed. They dragged iron hooks through the shallows on both sides. They sent 2 men in a flatboat to check the eddies where driftwood and trash collected. They walked the levee on both sides for a quarter mile in each direction, looking for a place where a man might have climbed out or where the bank had given way. They found nothing. No body, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle, just the smooth black water and the sound of the spillway and those boots sitting dry on wet stone. By midday, word had spread. More men arrived from the cabins and farms along the canal. They brought dogs. The dogs sniffed the boots, sniffed the cabin, sniffed the path. Then they followed the trail down to the lock, noses low, tails stiff. At the edge of the stone platform, every dog stopped. They whined. They lay down flat on their bellies and wouldn't go farther, even when their handlers pulled the leashes and spoke sharp. One of the older men, a trapper named Gaspar who'd worked that stretch of water his whole life, looked at the dogs and shook his head. "They smell death," someone said. Gaspar spat into the water. "They smell worse than that." Nobody asked him what he meant. Nobody wanted to know. They kept looking. They walked the canal bank for 2 miles in each direction. They checked the culverts, the spillways, the side channels where runoff pooled in stagnant backwaters. They looked in places a man couldn't fit and places a man wouldn't go. They poked poles into the thick muck under the cypress roots. They dragged the flatboat through water so shallow the keel scraped bottom. By the time the sun went down, they'd covered every foot of ground twice, and Aldrich Boudreau was still gone. That night, a few men stayed near the lock to keep watch. They lit lanterns and sat on the cabin porch, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and talking low. The spillway roared in the dark. Frogs called from the black water. The air was thick and still. Around 2 in the morning, one of the men, a young bargeman named Clovis, said he heard footsteps on the stone platform below. Slow, heavy steps on wet stone, the kind a man makes in work boots when he's carrying his weight careful on slippery ground. Clovis stood up fast, knocking his chair back. He grabbed his lantern and held it out over the porch rail. The light swung across the platform. The water rushed past, black and smooth. The boots were still there, side by side, dry. The platform was empty. "You hear that?" Clovis said. The other men nodded. They'd heard it too. Clovis sat back down. He didn't say anything else the rest of the night. None of them did. By the third day, the search had turned into something else. It wasn't about finding Boudreau anymore. It was about understanding what had happened to him, and nobody wanted to say out loud what they were starting to think. The canal company sent a man down from Baton Rouge to take over the lock. He moved into the cabin, put his things on the shelf, and tried to sleep in Boudreau's cot. He lasted 2 nights. On the third morning, he packed his bag and left without a word. Men in southern Louisiana still won't work a lock alone at night. They won't crank a floodgate after midnight unless there's another man standing close enough to touch. Old bargemen along that canal tell the younger ones, if you hear boots on stone and there's nobody standing there, you don't stop to look. You push off and you keep moving downriver. You don't tie up near that lock after dark. You don't answer if you hear your name called from the platform. The boots stayed where they were for a week. Nobody wanted to touch them. Finally, the supervisor from Baton Rouge came back with a company foreman. He picked the boots up barehanded, turned them over, looked inside. He said they were just boots, good leather, well kept. He took them back to the cabin and put them in a wooden crate under the desk, lid nailed shut. 3 days later, they were back on the platform. Same spot, same position. Toes pointed toward the water. Bone dry. They tried to build a timeline. That was the first thing the men from the canal company wanted when they arrived from Baton Rouge. A clear line of hours, names, who saw what and when. But the more people they talked to, the less sense it made. Thibault, the old bargeman, said he'd seen Boudreau at the landing just before sunset the night of the rain. Boudreau was carrying a coil of rope and a tin of grease for the crank wheel. He nodded at Thibault, but didn't stop to talk. That was normal. Boudreau wasn't a man who wasted words. Thibault pushed off and drifted downstream to his usual mooring spot near the bend. He said that was around 7 o'clock, maybe a little after. The woman who lived in the cabin closest to the lock, a widow named Mrs. Arsenault, said she heard Boudreau's door close around 9:30. She was sitting on her porch trying to get some air before the rain came harder. She heard the latch click, heard his boots on the gravel path heading down toward the water. She didn't see him, but she knew the sound of his walk. Steady even, no hurry. She went inside when the rain started drumming loud on the roof. The bargeman moored downstream, a man named Prudhomme, said he heard the crank wheel grinding just after 11. He was lying in his boat under a tarp, half asleep, and the sound woke him up. Metal on metal, slow and rhythmic, the way it always sounded when Boudreau was opening the gate by hand. Prudhomme said it went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. He heard the water start to pour through the spillway, that deep roar that meant the gate was open wide. He rolled over and went back to sleep. He said he didn't hear anything else unusual, but Mrs. Arsenault's brother, a man named Emile who stayed with her sometimes when he wasn't working the lumber camps, said he heard boots on gravel again around midnight. He was smoking on the back step of the cabin, watching the rain taper off. He heard footsteps coming up from the direction of the lock, heavy and deliberate, like someone walking uphill in mud. He thought it was Boudreau going back to his cabin after finishing the job. He crushed out his cigarette and went to bed. That should have been the end of it. Boudreau opened the gate, walked back to his cabin, and went to sleep. But the logbook entry said 12:47 a.m. 47 minutes after Emile heard the footsteps, and the handwriting was clear, steady, unhurried. Not the kind of writing a man does standing up in the rain with a lantern in one hand. He went back down, one of the company men said, checked the gate a second time, wrote it down late. Thibault shook his head. Then where are the boot prints coming back up the path? Nobody had an answer for that. They kept asking. A fisherman working the backwaters south of the lock said he heard a low whistle around 4:30 in the morning, just before first light. 2 notes, short and sharp, the kind cattlemen used to move a herd. He said it came from somewhere near the lock, maybe a little upstream. He thought it was strange because Boudreau didn't keep cattle, and nobody else lived close enough to the water to be walking around in the dark. But he didn't think much of it. Sound carried strange over water, especially in the fog that came up before dawn. Except Prudhomme, the bargeman, said he was already awake by 4:30, getting ready to push off, and he didn't hear any whistle. and Prudhomme was closer. "Maybe you were still half asleep," someone said to the fisherman. "I was awake," the fisherman said. "I heard it clear." By the fourth day, they had more men searching, 20, maybe 25, walking the levees and the low ground on both sides of the canal. They tied strips of white cloth to the fence posts and the cypress branches to mark where they'd already been. They moved in a line, shoulder to shoulder, calling Boudreau's name every few minutes, and stopping to listen. The only answer was the roar of the spillway and the high buzz of mosquitoes. They dragged hooks through every eddy and backwater within a mile of the lock. They checked under the docks where the old pilings had rotted and left gaps a body could slip through. They poked long poles into the thick muck under the cypress roots where the water sat black and still. One man said he felt something soft under the pole, something that gave when he pushed. They brought a boat over, and 2 men went down into the water up to their chests, hands reaching blind into the mud. They pulled up a rotted feed sack heavy with silt. Nothing else. The dogs wouldn't work anymore. After the first day, none of them would go past the edge of the platform. They'd sniff the air, whine low in their throats, and pull back toward the path. One handler brought a younger dog, a hound that had never been to the lock before, thinking maybe it was just the older dogs that were spooked. The hound followed the scent down the path, nose low, tail up. It got within 10 feet of the platform, stopped dead, and lay flat on the ground with its ears back. It wouldn't move. The handler had to carry it back up the path. "Something died here," Gaspar the trapper said. "Something big." "We didn't find a body," one of the company men said. "Doesn't mean nothing died." On the 5th night, 3 men volunteered to stay on the platform itself, right where the boots had been. They brought blankets, lanterns, a pot of coffee. They said if something was happening at the lock, they'd see it firsthand. Thibault told them it was a bad idea. The older men from the canal camps agreed, but the 3 men were young and tired of walking in circles, and they stayed anyway. They lasted until just after midnight. One of them, a man named Broussard, came back up the path walking fast, his face pale in the lantern light. The other 2 were right behind him. Broussard sat down on the cabin porch, hands shaking, and didn't say anything for a long time. "What happened?" Thibault asked. "We heard him," Broussard said. "Heard who?" "Boudreau, walking on the stones. We all heard it. Boots on wet stone, same rhythm Mrs. Archinot's brother said he heard that night. We had our lanterns up. We looked everywhere. There was nobody there." One of the other men, pale and quiet, nodded. "It walked past us. I swear to God it walked right between us. We felt the air move." The third man didn't say anything. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, staring at his hands. Nobody stayed on the platform after that. They found something strange on the 6th day. One of the younger men, searching the low brush upstream from the lock, saw a strip of white cloth tied to a fence post about 40 yards from the water. It looked like the strips they'd been using to mark their search grid, but when they checked their count, they had all their strips accounted for. Someone had tied a new one, or something had. The cloth was clean, bright white. The knot was tight and even, tied the same way the searchers had been taught to tie them. But nobody remembered being that far upstream, and nobody remembered tying cloth to that particular post. "Maybe one of us forgot," someone said. "Or maybe someone's playing games," another man said. Thibault walked over to the post and looked at the knot. He didn't touch it. After a moment, he turned around and told everyone to keep moving. They covered more ground that day than any day before. They searched a full 2 miles upstream and 2 miles downstream. They checked abandoned trapper shacks, old boat landings, sections of levee that hadn't been walked in years. They found possum bones, rotted rope, a rusted saw blade half buried in the mud. They didn't find Aldrich Boudreau. By the 7th day, some of the men started to leave. They had work to get back to, families waiting, timber crews and fishing boats that couldn't wait forever. The ones who stayed were the ones who'd known Boudreau longest. Thibault, Gaspar, a few of the older bargemen and lock workers who'd shared a drink with him or helped him repair the gate on hot afternoons when the work went faster with 2 men. They didn't talk much anymore. They just kept walking, kept looking, kept dragging their hooks through water that never gave anything back. Mrs. Arsenault brought food down from her cabin. Cornbread, boiled eggs, a pot of red beans she carried carefully down the path. She set it on the porch and didn't stay. Her brother Emile stopped smoking on the back step at night. He stayed inside after dark now, door latched, window shut even in the heat. The old hands are already talking, Thibault said one evening, sitting on the cabin porch with Gaspar and 2 other men. They're saying nobody should work the lock alone anymore, not after dark. It's just talk, one of the younger men said. Talk turns into rules, Gaspar said. You'll see. On the 8th day they smelled smoke. It came from somewhere near the platform, sharp and sudden, like green wood burning hot. They all smelled it at the same time. A dozen men spread out along the levee, all lifting their heads at once. They walked toward the lock. The smell got stronger, but there was no fire, no coals, no ash. The platform was empty except for the crank wheel and the iron rail and the sound of water pouring through the open gate. The smell faded after a few minutes, like it had never been there at all. That night, Thibault stood on the cabin porch and looked down at the platform. The lantern in his hand threw long shadows across the wet stones. He thought about the boots, about the logbook entry, about the sound Broussard and the others had heard. He thought about the way the dogs wouldn't go near the platform anymore, the way the young hound had flattened itself on the ground like something had pressed it down. He thought about the way people in southern Louisiana used to talk about certain places along the water, places where things didn't sit right, where the air felt wrong, where men disappeared and the land didn't give them back. We're not going to find him, Gaspar said from behind him. Thibault didn't argue. The next morning, they found a second set of boot prints. They were in the same mud where Boudreau's original tracks had been, running parallel, almost on top of the first set. But these prints were fresh. The edges were sharp. The mud was still damp. And they walked the same path, down from the cabin, across the gravel, onto the platform. No prints coming back. Nobody said anything for a long time. One of the men bent down to measure the print with his hand. He looked up at Thibault, his face tight. Same size, same sole, same hitch on the right foot. Thibault looked at the platform, at the space where the boots had stood, at the water rushing past, black and smooth and endless. We're done, he said. They walked back up the path in silence. Behind them, the spillway roared. Somewhere in the distance, a low whistle sounded, 2 notes, short and sharp, like a man calling across the water in the dark. By the 2nd week, the search had become something else. It wasn't about covering ground anymore. It was about proving they'd done everything they could, about walking the same paths one more time so nobody could say they'd given up too soon. The men moved slower now. They didn't call Boudreau's name as often. When they did, their voices sounded flat, like they were only going through the motions. The canal company brought in a man from New Orleans, someone who'd worked river accidents before. His name was Landry. He had a notebook and a clean suit that didn't belong anywhere near the mud and the cypress water. He asked the same questions everyone had already asked, wrote down the same answers in careful script, and stood on the platform for a long time looking at the place where the boots had been. You moved them, he said to Thibault. We put them in the cabin, Thibault said, locked in a crate. And they came back. That's right. Landry wrote something in his notebook. Who has access to the cabin? Everyone. Nobody. The door doesn't lock. Never did. So someone could have taken the boots out of the crate and placed them back on the platform. Thibault didn't answer right away. He looked at Gaspar, then back at Landry. You think someone's playing a game with us? I think people do strange things when a man goes missing, Landry said. I've seen it before. Guilt, grief, sometimes fear. Then explain the boot prints, Gaspar said. The second set, same size, same sole, same worn edge on the right foot. Fresh prints going down to the platform and none coming back. Explain that. Landry closed his notebook. I can't. The boots were back in the cabin now, still in the crate, but nobody had nailed the lid shut this time. Nobody wanted to touch them long enough to do it. The crate sat in the corner near the desk, and when the wind came through the gaps in the walls, you could hear something shift inside. A soft scrape of leather on wood that made men turn their heads and look, even though they knew what it was. On the 10th day, they searched the cabin itself. Not for Boudreau. Nobody thought he was hiding in a one-room shack with no cellar and no crawl space, but for anything that might explain what had happened. Letters, debts, a name written down somewhere that didn't belong. Landry went through the desk drawer by drawer while Thibault and 2 other men watched from the doorway. He found the usual things: receipts for rope and lamp oil, a few coins in a tin. A letter from Boudreau's son dated 3 months back asking if his father needed help with repairs before the summer floods. At the bottom of the last drawer, under a folded map of the canal system, Landry found a second logbook. It was older than the one on the desk, the cover stained dark with water and age. Landry opened it carefully. The pages were filled with entries in Boudreau's handwriting, going back years, dates, times, gate openings, water levels, everything neat and methodical, the kind of records a man keeps when he takes his work seriously. Landry flipped toward the end. The last entry in the old logbook was dated 2 years back. After that, the pages were blank. He was about to close it when Thibault leaned in and pointed. "Turn the page." Landry turned it. On the next page, in Boudreau's handwriting, was a single line. "If the gate opens by itself, don't go down alone." The ink was dark. The letters were firm and clear. But the page was in the middle of blank space, and there was no date, no time, no context. Just that one sentence, sitting there like a warning written to no one. "When did he write that?" Landry asked. "I don't know," Thibault said, "but he wrote it." Landry stared at the page. "The gate can't open by itself. It takes a man on the crank wheel. You've seen it. It's iron. It's heavy. It doesn't move without force." "I know," Thibault said. They stood there in silence. Outside, the spillway roared. The wind moved through the cypress trees with a sound like water over stones. Somewhere downstream, a barge horn blew, low and mournful. Landry closed the logbook and set it on the desk next to the current one. "I want to talk to everyone who knew him, everyone who worked with him. I want to know if he ever mentioned anything strange. Voices, lights, anything." They talked to Mrs. Arsenault first. She sat on her porch with her hands folded in her lap and told them the same thing she'd told the others. She'd heard Boudreau's door close the night of the rain. She'd heard his boots on the gravel. She hadn't seen him, but she knew his walk. After a moment, she added something new. "He stopped coming to my porch for coffee about a month ago," she said. "He used to come by on Sunday mornings. We'd sit and talk a little. Then he stopped. I asked him why one day when I saw him at the landing. He said he didn't sleep well anymore. Said he kept hearing things at night." "What kind of things?" Landry asked. He didn't say, but he looked tired. More tired than a man should look just from missing sleep. Her brother Emile, sitting on the step below her, nodded. "I asked him about it too. He said the gate made noises sometimes, shifting, creaking, like something was testing the weight." "Gates do that," Landry said. "Metal expands and contracts. Water pressure shifts." "That's what I told him," Emile said. "But he said it wasn't like that. He said it sounded like someone was turning the wheel, slow, just a few inches at a time. He'd go down to check and the gate would be where he left it, locked tight, but the sound would come back the next night." Landry wrote it all down. When he finished, he asked if anyone else had heard the stories. "Everyone heard them," Mrs. Arsenault said, "but nobody wanted to believe them. Boudreau wasn't the kind of man who made things up. If he said he heard something, he heard it." They talked to Prudhomme, the bargeman. He said Boudreau had asked him a strange question about 2 weeks before he disappeared. They had been standing on the landing watching the water, and Boudreau had asked if Prudhomme had ever seen someone at the lock late at night, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. "I said no," Prudhomme told Landry. "I asked him if he'd seen someone. He didn't answer right away. Then he said maybe he had, or maybe he'd just been awake too long. He said sometimes he'd look out the cabin window at night and see a shape standing on the platform, just standing there, not moving. He'd light his lantern and go down to check and there'd be nobody, but the next night he'd see it again. Did he report it to the company? Landry asked. No. He thought they'd say he was losing his mind. Gaspar, who'd been listening from the edge of the group, spat into the dirt. He wasn't losing his mind. Something was down there. Something, Landry repeated. That's right. What kind of something? Gaspar looked at him for a long time, the kind that takes a man and leaves his boots behind, the kind that writes in his logbook after he's already gone, the kind that walks on stone without making footprints. You want me to give it a name? I can't. But people in Louisiana know what it is, even if they don't say it out loud. Landry didn't write that down. By the 12th day, the theories had started to spread. Some said Boudreau had enemies, a man who'd worked alone for 9 years, who kept to himself, who didn't drink or gamble or talk much. Maybe he'd crossed someone without knowing it. Maybe someone had followed him down to the lock that night and done something terrible and hidden the body where it wouldn't be found. The canal ran for miles. The backwaters were deep. A man could disappear into that black water and never come up. Others said it was the land. The old-timers, the trappers and fishermen who'd worked the bayous their whole lives, said there were places along the water that didn't sit right. Places where the ground felt wrong underfoot, where the air tasted like metal, where things went missing and didn't come back. They said the lock sat on one of those places. They said Boudreau had known it too, and that's why he'd stopped sleeping well. A few, the ones who'd heard the footsteps on the platform or smelled the smoke that had no source, whispered that it wasn't a man at all that had taken Boudreau. They said it was something that had been there longer than the lock, longer than the canal, something that had watched him open and close the gate for 9 years and finally decided to pull him down into the water or the mud or whatever dark place it came from. They didn't say this in front of Landry. They said it quietly to each other, when the lanterns were low and the night pressed in close. But everyone, no matter what they believed, agreed on one thing. Nobody was going to work that lock alone anymore. Not at night. Not in the rain. Not when the water ran high and the gate had to be opened by hand. The canal company could make whatever rules it wanted, but the men who worked the water had already made their own. 2 men at the lock, always. One to turn the crank, one to watch, and if you heard footsteps on wet stone when nobody was standing there, you didn't stop to look. You got back up the path and you didn't come down again until daylight. After that week, nobody in southern Louisiana took that job alone. Not then, not now. On the 14th day, Landry packed his notebook and his clean suit and took the barge back to New Orleans. Before he left, he told Thibault the case would stay open, but there was nothing more he could do. No body, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just a man who'd walked down to do his job one rainy night and never come back. What about the boots? Thibault asked. What about them? You going to put that in your report? That they were dry on wet stone? That they came back after we locked them away? Landry looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Nobody would believe it. We believe it, Thibault said. Landry didn't answer. He stepped onto the barge and didn't look back. That afternoon, Thibault went into the cabin one last time. The logbooks were still on the desk, the current one and the old one Landry had found. He opened the old one to the page with the warning. If the gate opens by itself, don't go down alone. He read it 3 times, then closed the book and put it back in the drawer. He looked at the crate in the corner. The lid was still loose. He walked over and lifted it with 2 fingers, just enough to see inside. The boots were gone. He dropped the lid and stepped back. His heart was hammering. He looked around the cabin, under the cot, behind the stove, in the corners where shadows pooled thick. Nothing. He walked outside. The platform was empty. The water rushed past, black and smooth. The spillway roared. He stood there for a long time, waiting, though he didn't know what he was waiting for. That night, 3 men staying in the cabins near the lock all woke at the same time. They said later they didn't know why. No sound had woken them. No dream. They just opened their eyes in the dark and felt the air change, like something heavy had moved through it. One of them, a young man named Alcide, got up and looked out his window. Down on the platform, lit faint by the moon, He saw the boots, standing side by side, toes pointed toward the water, bone dry. He didn't go down to check. He pulled the shutters closed and sat on his cot until the sun came up. The canal company sent a new lockkeeper 3 weeks after Boudreau disappeared. His name was Verret. He was young, maybe 25, and he came from upriver, where the water ran clean and the work was steady. He didn't know the stories yet. Nobody told him right away. He lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, he walked up to Mrs. Archenaux's cabin and told her he was done. He said he'd heard footsteps on the platform every night since he'd arrived. Heavy boots on wet stone, always around 2 in the morning, always the same rhythm. He'd gone down with his lantern the first 2 nights to check. Nobody there. Just the water and the sound of the spillway and those boots standing at the edge, dry and neat. On the 3rd night, he heard the crank wheel turning. Slow. Deliberate. He ran down the path. The gate hadn't moved. It was locked tight. But his hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the lantern. "I'm not staying," he told Mrs. Archenaux. He left that afternoon. The company sent another man a week later. That one lasted 2 nights. The 3rd man they sent took one look at the platform, asked who the last lockkeeper was, and when someone said Boudreau's name, he walked back to the barge without unloading his bag. After that, the company changed the rules. 2 men per shift. Always. 1 to work the gate, 1 to watch. They built a second cot in the cabin and raised the pay. The turnover was still high. Men would work the lock for a few months, save their money, and leave. The ones who stayed wouldn't go near the platform alone after dark. By the end of that first year, the stories had spread up and down the canal. Bargemen told other bargemen, fishermen told trappers. Boudreau's name became a warning. "That's a Boudreau stretch of water," someone would say, and everyone would know what it meant. A place where a man could vanish doing ordinary work and leave nothing behind but questions. The boots stayed on the platform. Nobody moved them anymore. Every few weeks, someone from the company would take them away, put them in a crate, nail it shut. It didn't matter. The boots always came back, always in the same spot, always dry. After a while, people stopped trying. The boots became part of the lock. You didn't touch them. You didn't talk about them where the new workers could hear. You just kept your distance. Children growing up along the canal learned the rules early. Don't go near the lock after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name called from the water. If you see boots standing on stone, you walk the other way. Mothers told their daughters. Fathers told their sons. The rules became part of life along that stretch of water, as ordinary as knowing which snakes to avoid. By 1895, almost 10 years after Boudreau disappeared, the lock had a reputation that reached Baton Rouge. Men looking for work would ask which lock they'd be assigned to, and if someone said the one south of the Archenaux cabins, they'd find a reason to turn the job down. The company started hiring men who didn't speak English, figuring they wouldn't hear the stories. But the stories didn't need language. The boots were still there. The footsteps still came at night. The workers learned fast. In 1903, an engineer from the Army Corps came to inspect the lock. He'd heard the stories and didn't believe them. He spent 3 days checking the gate mechanism, examining the platform for cracks. He found nothing wrong. On his last night, he stayed on the platform to prove a point. He brought a chair, a lantern, coffee. He sat there from sunset to midnight writing notes. At 10 past midnight, he packed his things and walked back up the path. He didn't run, but he didn't look back. In his report, he wrote that the lock was fully operational. He didn't mention the boots. He didn't mention the footsteps he'd heard circling his chair while his lantern showed nothing but empty stone. He recommended a 2-man crew at all times. The lock stayed open. In 1912, a boy named Thomas, 11 years old, was walking home along the levee. It was late afternoon, still daylight. He saw the boots on the platform and climbed down to look. He bent close. The leather was clean, uncracked. He reached out one hand. His older sister, walking behind, screamed his name. Thomas pulled his hand back and stood up. His sister was on the path above, her face white. She didn't say anything else. Thomas climbed back up, and they walked home. That night he asked his father why the boots were still there after so many years. His father set down his fork. Some things don't leave, Thomas. Some things stay because they're supposed to stay. You don't ask why. You just leave them alone. Thomas never went near the lock again. By 1920, Thibault was an old man. He still worked the canal, but he moved slower now. He didn't talk much about Boudreaux anymore. Most of the men who'd been there for the search were gone. But Thibault remembered, sometimes passing the lock in the early morning. He'd see the platform and the boots and the empty space where a man used to stand. And he'd feel it again. That cold weight in his chest. That certainty that something wrong had happened and was still happening. One morning he saw a new kid working the lock alone, maybe 19. Thibault climbed the path and said, quiet and firm, "Where's your partner?" "He's coming," the kid said. "You don't work it alone," Thibault said. "Not here." The kid looked annoyed. "It's just a gate." Thibault pointed at the boots. "You see those? Man who wore those worked the gate alone. One night he went down to open it, never came back. They found his boots right there, dry on wet stone. That was 34 years ago. You ask yourself why they're still there, why this lock pays double and still can't keep workers. Then ask yourself if you want to be the next pair of boots." The kid's face went pale. "Two men," Thibault said. "Always, and if you hear footsteps when nobody's there, you go back up the path." The kid nodded. Thibault never saw him alone on the platform again. In 1927, the company tried to remove the boots for good. They sent a crew to break up the platform and replace it with concrete. They worked for 3 days. On the 4th morning, they found the boots sitting on top of the rubble, neat and dry. The foreman told them to pack up. They poured new concrete over the broken stone and left the boots where they were. When the concrete dried, the boots were still on top. They're still there now. Over the decades, people came up with explanations. Some said Boudreaux staged his own disappearance, though that didn't explain the boots or the logbook entry or the fresh boot prints in searched mud. Others said he'd drowned and the current carried him downstream, though that didn't explain why his boots were dry or why they kept returning. A few said he'd been murdered, though that didn't explain the footsteps or the crank wheel turning on its own or the dogs refusing to go near the platform. But the old-timers along the canal had a different explanation. They said some places were doors, and sometimes those doors opened, and if you were standing in the wrong spot, you went through and didn't come back. They said the lock was one of those places. They said Boudreaux had known it, had felt it for months, and that's why he couldn't sleep, why he'd heard the gate moving at night, why he'd written that warning. They said whatever took him was still there, still waiting, still walking on wet stone in the dark. They said that's why the boots stayed. A reminder, a warning. People in southern Louisiana still follow the rules. Nobody works that lock alone. Nobody goes near the platform after dark. New workers are told their first day, 2 men, always, and if you hear boots on stone, you don't look. Mothers still tell children to stay away from the water near the lock. The canal still runs. Barges still pass through, but everyone who works that water knows the name Aldrich Boudreaux, and everyone knows what happened, even if they don't agree on what it means. The boots are still there, dry, neat, waiting. So which version makes sense? The one where a man vanished because of debt or accident or crime, or the one where something that shouldn't exist pulled him through a door that shouldn't be there and left his boots behind as proof? Which version explains the logbook entry written after he was gone? The footsteps heard by dozens of people, the boots that won't stay gone no matter how many times they're removed. And why, after almost 140 years, do people in southern Louisiana still refuse to say out loud what they really think happened that rainy night in 1886? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.